Paul. People would want to hear more about your personal and political motivations to embark on this long-term important project. Let's hear something from you. It could be some short comments, but also questions. Maybe Brennan can take a microphone around.
Thank you. Thanks for the preview and for what you're doing. And it's very important to raise these issues and get that message out there. I want to just ask you a bit more about how to stop the nuclear war part, because that's your title. And I'm assuming if you haven't finished it yet, there's lots of scope for more than is in the preview. But for instance, you had an interview with Susie Snyder from ICANN, and I'm sure you know about the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons and what's going on. I mean, globally, there's a lot more going on than there is in this country about this issue, as I'm sure you know. And there's also a lot of potential. You mentioned that you had some things there about the companies, and you said it's just a thimbleful for them, for BlackRock or whatever. But that's also a huge opportunity in terms of getting rid of these weapons, because it is a thimbleful, and it's something that we know has worked in the past on the nuclear issue back in the 80s. It's worked on apartheid and many other campaigns to put pressure on these companies and to get some results that way. So I just wonder if you can say a bit more about what your vision is for the stopping part in the film.
Yeah, sure. Well, the film is going to try to accomplish two big major things. I'll start with the second, which is what you're raising. There are concrete steps that can be taken to reduce the risk of nuclear war. I've talked to hundreds of experts now. I've talked to some people that are military leaders, political leaders. Nobody can say the risk of accidental war, miscalculation, error. Nobody can say the risk is zero. Everybody thinks it's far from zero. You can't put a number on it. I did a calculation once. I'm living in Toronto now. What are the odds of your house burning down in Toronto in a given year? It's less than 1%. But we all buy fire insurance for a house. Less than 1% is enough to spend a lot of money on fire insurance. The risk of nuclear war, we don't know. You want to say it's 1%. There's been calculations it's even higher. But if the risk of not your house burning down, if the risk is the end of human civilization, and it could happen in an hour or two, and it could be tonight or tomorrow or next week, who knows, don't you do something about it? Doesn't the society have to talk about it? Yeah. There are like at the end of this, we have some very concrete policies that would reduce the risk, like number one in the United States, get rid of ICBMs, get rid of launch on warning. It's the most dangerous. We're getting into this era of AI. We'll dig into those things more. But the question, why aren't we doing any of those things? Quite the contrary, we're modernizing and expanding the nuclear arsenal. So why is there this cloak of denial that's very hard to pierce? That Don't Bank on the Bomb campaign from ICANN's good. But let's be honest, it's barely making a dent, because if one bank pulls out, another one moves in. It doesn't actually reduce the amount of capital that's available for this stuff. It's a great beginning of how to think about putting pressure on these institutions. But without a mass movement, without a real awakening of the population on these issues, you can't get it won't have the clout. And for some reason, honestly, to some extent, it escapes me why the more conscious, smarter financial elites themselves aren't already more concerned about this. And I can tell you if you want to ask about some speculation about why they aren't more concerned. But the first thing we're going to try to do is try to get to why people don't wake up about this. And I think it has to do with not understanding the history of how we got here. And it's tied to another thing. But we have to learn how to talk to people about who we are. Because our own identities are wrapped up in historical denial. Who we, right to our core is who we are as people. I mean, I'm not immune. None of us are immune to it. Like, I go through my daily life. I had a nice dinner. I'm here doing this. Da 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 da. How many million people are starving in the world right now? Literally starving to death. Generally, and more particularly in Gaza. But we get out. We go on with our life. I mean, in some ways, it's hard to do otherwise, and still, live your life unless you want to be a full-time activist. And some people do, but it's hard for most people. But how do we break through? And I'm hoping the nuclear issue is actually a way to pierce this that might help on other issues as well. This isn't something you can be in denial about and hope to survive. Everyone I know that knows the issues, they all think if we don't do something dramatic to reduce the risk, leading to abolishment, but at least reduce the risk, nuclear war is inevitable. It's going to happen. And if it isn't happening in your lifetime, our lifetime, it will be our kids or our kids' kids. It's not that far off. It's getting far worse. And one of the things that we have to connect for people is the more the climate crisis develops, the more there is risk of nuclear war. Imagine an India and a Pakistan and a China with more than half their agriculture gone, which could be within 20 years.
Because of climate change.
Because of climate change. You look at the American agriculture, when we start getting past north of 3 degrees, which could be way sooner than people think. I mean, it could be by 2050. We might, we've been talking the end of the century. A while, it wasn't that long ago. The end of the century was going to be 2 degrees. We might be at 2 degrees now, or we might be there within 10 to 15 years. We might actually already be at a global average increase of 2 degrees. We actually have kind of hit it already. The Arctic is there. Imagine a world where most agriculture is already wiped out, water is depleted. Take every geopolitical fracture line, whether it's India, Pakistan, whether it's India, China, whether it's what happens to Russia, which is so dependent on fossil fuel. And now you're at a stage where the world actually starts to get, you've got to phase out fossil fuel. Now you have a militarized Russia with no economy anymore. I mean,
And millions of climate refugees moving across borders.
I was going to get to that.
Yeah.
What happens to the tens of millions of people that have to head north? Well, they're already planning. What's the planning? The wall. The wall isn't about just some migrant labor coming north. The wall is getting ready to have machine guns all set up on the top of the wall to stop millions of people coming from South America. I mean, we're heading into, I hate to use the word end times, but it's not inevitable. We have to find a way to organize. And I think one piece of this, how to find a way to organize, is one, yes, you have to understand. 2, you got to get the history of the Cold War. You got to try to teach yourself how we got here. But we have to learn how to talk to people that don't agree with us. And I'll just give you one example that kind of worked for me, and I think I learned something from it. I was going to do a film a few years ago. It was going to be called Why Do They Hate Us? And I was going to take 9/11 families to India and Pakistan and get them to go around just asking, why do you hate us? And I started interviewing 9/11 families, seeing if they'd come on the trip. And the ones I said, most of them wanted to, because they genuinely wanted an answer. And the one guy I talked to was a police chief, a fire chief, who'd been at 9/11, was one of the fire chiefs as the buildings were first on fire. His son was a fireman that went up and never came down and was in the building when it crashed. So this guy had been a Democrat his whole life, He founds, this is back during Bush's presidency, he founds an organization called Democrats for Bush. He was so furious at Al-Qaeda and the terrorists and Arabs and whatever. They killed his kid, they killed all these people. And I said, you know, I made a film in Afghanistan. I made a film called Return to Kandahar. I was there in the spring of 2002. And I said, do you want to know a little bit what I learned about the history of Afghanistan? And he said, yeah. And you probably know this, but I gave him some of the background, including how the CIA brought bin Laden to Afghanistan because they felt they needed an Arab leader to rally the forces against the Soviet invaders. Bin Laden was a CIA asset to begin with, absolutely verified, no conspiracy. I mean, I hate this idea, conspiracy theory, because history is a history of conspiracies. But anyhow, I'm telling the fire chief this, and and I gave him more background into how the Afghan thing developed. You know, you people probably know, you know, the whole thing was engineered by the United States, not just about inducing the Soviets to invade, but getting the Shah of Iran to give $40 million to the president of Afghanistan to break with the Soviet Union. And that's what starts the ball rolling that leads to the arming of the jihadists and so on and so on. Anyway, the guy's looking at me. He did not know a word of what I was saying. Not a word of that history. And honestly, most Americans don't know any of that history. But he told me his head exploded. And I didn't try to argue with him about his beliefs. I just told him what I knew about the history. And I think we need to learn how to talk to people who don't agree with us, and particularly people, the 75 million people that voted for Trump, or the people that keep getting fooled by corporate Democrats. By calmly telling them, well, you know, here's the history, and you can check it. It's verified. I mean, I can tell you stuff about the Cold War. I'm sure your heads will blow up, how consciously and deliberately they lied to erect this structure of nuclear weapons, military bases everywhere, knowing they're gambling with the apocalypse. So what I'm getting at is, and why I'm making the film, is to try to make this a tool for people to help talk to others in a really calm, historical way. Let's get past all the partisan rhetoric and all the inflammatory language, and really calmly try to talk through how the hell did we get here? Because I don't think enough people are going to be able to take a position on what to do about it now. Because well, what Dan said, you know, he finally realized he was living in an illusion. Well, most of us are living in an illusion.
Thanks. Yeah, there's a hand back there.
It's me.
Yeah.
Should I stand? Oh, I hate the sound.
You want to introduce yourself?
So my name is Eric Ross. I'm a PhD candidate in the history department, and trying to formulate a question. It's been a long day, but basically, I'm kind of hearing two things at once, which is, on the one hand, so for example, I'm an organizer. I also study nuclear weapons, and those two things very rarely meet. Because I think that the nuclear weapons work is still kind of tainted with the perception that this is largely a white upper middle class kind of single issue. And I know you're speaking, and I am in full agreement with this need to kind of reach people with education. But at the same time, like in other organizing spaces, we have this issue in which the problem is that this is kind of still an abstraction, even though it's very real. But if you're not seeing, right, this is part of this broader kind of intersectional solidarity, right, then you're not taken seriously. And in this moment, like the kind of every day I come back to Rosa Luxemburg said in World War I, right, the choice is clear, socialism or barbarism. And right in this moment when, long ago Wall Street captured Washington and all of these issues with the corporate Democrats that you're talking about, it seems that picking the nuclear weapon issue is kind of like a Band-Aid on a bullet hole, a much needed Band-Aid, but whether or not we can make this change within the existing political and social structures in this country, or whether, when we're thinking of questions of rising fascism and the fact that even our the elites in power in this moment are completely insulated and not receptive to the will of the people, that like the change needs to be this broader structural change, and this will enable our move away from nuclear weapons, which were built on the illogic, right, of capitalism and imperialism, especially in this country. And so I guess it's a really long-winded, I apologize, way of asking, right, whether we can actually achieve these aims through some sort of like single issue reform agenda, or whether this needs to be part of a broader kind of structural overhaul of the system, or somewhere in between, of course. So yeah, thank you.
I think the answer is, if we don't do both, we won't be around to do the more radical agenda. And I think the nuclear issue is different than climate in this way. I don't think you can really profoundly deal with what's absolutely needed for the climate crisis without some profound changes to the economy. I don't know how we get to real climate policy that matters without nationalizing the fossil fuel companies. I just don't even see it. Everything else seems to be nibbling around the edges, and we're unfortunately far from that. But the nuclear issue is not the same issue. There are times in history where the interests of the elites systemically actually align with the interests of working people. I'll give you an example. In 1800s England, child labor generally, but particularly in places like Wales where a lot of mining was going on, and female labor in the mines was actually threatening that there be any future workers. The women's pelvises were getting twisted, hauling rocks up to the surface and loading donkeys. The kids were down there put in little tiny crevices, hacking at iron ore on their backs. They actually put sharp rocks down the back of their shirts so they couldn't fall asleep when they're hacking rocks. This is not very long ago. So two things started happening. There was a movement from the working class against child labor, but the elites, some of them saw systemically that exactly who the hell's going to work in our industry if we're killing off the workers. So there were some class-conscious sections of the elites that saw an 8-hour working day, banning child labor was in the interests of capitalism, and for a moment, interests aligned. You somehow had, to some extent, you had that in the 30s with the New Deal. A section of elites saw the only way to save capitalism is mitigating the effects of the crisis. And the working class wasn't ready to do more, really. So there was an alignment. On the nuke issue, there's an alignment. Objectively, there's an alignment. Everyone gets killed. It doesn't matter how rich you are. So yes, I think the potential of some reform to reduce the risk is achievable because there is a reason for the elites to want to do it that isn't part of the fundamental differences, capital versus labor and so on. I don't think we get to abolishment without a more fundamental structural change. I wish, maybe if a nuke goes off somewhere, I hate to say it, maybe if somewhere it actually happens, it will freak people out enough. But abolishment I think it's a very important aspiration. It's very important to talk about. But without the kind of structural change you're talking about, war is very built into the system. And to deal with that, and the United States probably isn't the first place this is going to happen. I mean, let's be honest about where we are in the world. This is the home of the empire. It is not the first place there's probably going to be this kind of breakthrough. It might be in Brazil or India, I don't know, I'm hoping. So the answer to your question is, and the film won't do this, we won't treat this as if it's not part of a systemic issue. So as a teaching mechanism, we're going to talk about how America got militarized. Like everyone talks about the Manhattan Project, like all of a sudden we're going to have a bomb, let's have the Manhattan Project. But where were we as a society? It wasn't just because Germany was building a bomb that we had the Manhattan Project, because once they knew there was no German bomb, they kept building it. So it wasn't really about the German bomb, it was because they could do it, and they realized, they being the American political and economic and military elites, if we have the bomb, we rule the world. And that didn't begin in early 40s. It begins, during plantation culture. It begins with westward expansion. It begins with the rise of finance. It begins with the war profiteering in the Civil War. Is where J.P. Morgan learns, oh my God, war profiteering's really good. J.P. Morgan, a company he owned in the Civil War, bought rifles from the Union Army that were going to be discarded because they were considered too beat up for $2.25 a rifle. His company varnished the wood, did some minor oiling of the rifle, sold them back to the Union Army for $22.50. War profiteering is right in the DNA of the Industrial Revolution. It's in the DNA of westward expansion because you cannot control hundreds of thousands of slaves without an extensive military. You cannot steal land from indigenous peoples without a powerful military. So the militarization and then financialization, because Wall Street's in the middle of everything. Wall Street's the middleman for the southern cotton getting to England, which is the foundation of the Industrial Revolution in England, cheap cotton and the textile, industrialized manufacturing in England. Wall Street, did you know Wall Street sold insurance on slaves? I didn't know that until recently. If you were a slave owner and your slave died, it's an asset like your car. Insurance replaces your car. You could buy insurance to buy a new slave. That's all Wall Street. Eventually, Wall Street realizes wage labor is far more profitable for industrialization than slave labor. And so now they want, okay, let's free the slaves because we want them as wage slaves, not as slaves. And we want the West. Anyway, we are not going to make it a single issue in the way we put it into context. But there is a practical side to this. There are actually some things that could be done to reduce the risk. So our theory is, if we can wake people up to understand things at a systemic level, we'll be better at persuading people when you vote. Don't vote for anyone that doesn't have a reducing nuclear risk as part of their platform.
Hi, I'm Helen Seidler. I have a quick comment and then a question. I want to come back in my question to the economic point that you started with, because I think that is what opens the door to moving on this issue. But my comment has to do with the sort of the way you're putting the lying of the government and all the sort of deception that we have grown up with in terms of our history, American history. And I find that it's a barrier, I guess, that hearing that message is a barrier to what follows. And the reason I think it's a barrier, and I might frame it differently, I don't have great words right at the moment for doing that, but is because it's not like there were good guys on the other side either. And part of that Cold War mentality was understanding Stalin and what he did and his intentions for the populations around Russia that became the Soviet Union. And people who lived under Russian rule, basically, suffered greatly during this Cold War period. And there was some legitimacy in U.S. concern about Russian expansionism. So I'm not trying to defend us and the deeper analysis you produced, but I think that you've got to give us a little room for not, feeling like we've been kicked like a bunch of, dead dogs or something by our government. Because as I said, it's not like there were good guys on the other side.
Yeah. Well,
and just internationally, if you look at a lot of conflicts, you have very similar, real, genuine divisions where there are problems on both sides that need racism. So give us a little optimism or room to stand on, or some reason to be okay. That was the culture, that was the time, and there were reasons that people believed those things. And again, I'm not denying the chicanery of the government.
Yeah.
I just wanted to.
Yeah, no, it's an important point. Dan answers that point the best.
Okay. So my question comes back.
Can I deal with that first? Because Dan answers that really well.
Well, let me get my other point out, and then you can, so I can sit down here. On the economics point, my question really is, are there academic hot spots in the U.S., I'm sure there are internationally, where people can connect on these issues that are seeing the same kind of sort of grip that corporations and their support structure have on the American economy and other economies as well. Our representative, if you live in Northampton anyway, our representative to Congress has put legislation out about nuclear war. So that's one person I know of, Jim McGovern, who's clear on this issue, and I don't know who is he connected to. Is there some way to connect the folks that are already knowledgeable about this and build a communications platform?
Let me do the first one first, and let me respond to your first one and then the second one. Dan said it very well. He believed the Soviet Union was Hitler with a nuclear bomb, as Chris said. He came to understand that wasn't true. The Soviet Union, and Dan said it, and I mean everybody says it that knows, had a very repressive state. We can go into why and how that happened. But it was not a military expansionist state after Yalta. More or less, Stalin, after the Yalta Agreement, did almost nothing outside of what was the Yalta Agreement, and it's very exaggerated that this is just the Red Army conquering these countries. Most of these countries' partisan anti-fascist movements were led by communists. And there was a lot of popular support early for becoming part of the Soviet Union. Now later, they started to realize what a police state the Soviet state had become, and resistance grew, and also as the years went by, they started milking the various Soviet republics and this bullshit division of labor and so on and so on. But Dan came to know, and it's unrefutable based on searches of the Soviet archives, year after year of CIA analysis telling the leadership, American leadership, there is no Soviet military threat. So what was the threat? So one of the things we just discovered, how do I tell this quickly? Well, if someone wants to follow up, I can dig into this. But the Council on Foreign Relations, which is a Rockefeller institution, meaning Standard Oil, actually was planning post-World War II world all through World War II, working in a secret committee with the State Department. It's all verified in the archives of the CFR. The fundamental plan was, how do you stop any other country joining the Soviet sphere. That was the big objective. And how do you develop a financial architecture based on supposedly free markets, the US dollar, and so on? So they were planning the world during World War II. By 42, 43, they knew they were going to have the atomic bomb, which is going to be the thing that allowed America to determine what the world would be. And they're planning the financial architecture for markets open to American capital and so on. So the critical thing was, don't allow other countries to join this Soviet sphere. But the great threat wasn't Soviet expansion or Soviet military expansion. And the proof of that is the Vietnam War. Everybody knows anything about Vietnam knows the Vietnamese national liberation movement was not a puppet of the Soviet Union. Ho Chi Minh was not. They were fighting the French, then they fought the Americans, and they were always an independent national liberation movement. Yes, they got arms from the Soviets and the Chinese. It was never a story of Soviet expansionism. Yet America goes to war and not only kills, close to 3 million people and 55,000 American soldiers or so on. Why? When it's not about Soviet expansionism. Then what was it about? Keeping Vietnam out of a socialist sphere and the domino theory that sometimes people scoff at, it was a real theory. They were so afraid that the national liberation movement of Vietnam would inspire the same thing all over Africa, all over Asia, all over Latin America. All these national liberation movements would gravitate towards socialism. That was the enemy. So we need to explain this to people because how do I know it wasn't, the Soviet Union didn't have a plan to invade Western Europe and militarily expand? Because the CIA said so. And since then, the Soviet archive says so. Some of the most passionate anti-communist writers who have gone through the Soviet archives cannot find anything about a plan to invade anywhere. The closest they got was Afghanistan, and by that time, it's not Stalin anyway. I can go on more, but the other big piece of this isn't America as the evil empire as opposed to the Soviets as the evil empire. The whole thing about evil is full of shit. There is no evil. This whole thing about good and evil is bullshit. And it's funny, Kirk's wife just did this where she said, "I forgive my enemies." I'm glad she did if she means it. But what does love your enemy mean? To me, I'll tell you what it means. Because I don't hate Hitler. I'm Jewish. I don't hate Hitler. I don't hate any of these things. I don't love him, but I don't hate him. Because it's part of a historical process. If you understand that we are in this moment just part of a river of history that got us here, and we're not out of the river, we're in that river of history. Every moment that brought us here is still actively shaping today. So we don't get that. And the problem is, and I'm not talking about Chris because he's one of the exceptions, the way they teach history in schools is shit. They don't start from what's happening today and go backwards and say, how did we get here? They teach history like everything's in a museum. Oh, let's learn about the Battle of Hastings. I mean, why? Who gives a shit? It actually may matter to today, but if you don't connect it to today, I don't need to memorize what the Battle of Hastings was, which is why I gave up on high school. So I'm not trying to say Americans are evil through historical, random, geographical reasons. Just the U.S. became dominant. I'm Canadian. If Canada could have been the superpower, they'd jump at it. And they wouldn't have been any different. It's just, those aren't the cards Canada got. So this isn't about anything evil, bad about the United States. There's a global system at play here. And the way history developed, it's managed and led and dominated by the United States. Who knows, in 50 years, maybe it'll be China. And I don't think they'll be any better the way things are going. Right now, China's not as aggressive as the United States is. But it doesn't mean systemically they may not become that. Now, what's going on in Russia is extremely toxic. And there's internal reasons for it and external, the expansion of NATO, but that doesn't explain everything. Anyway, I'm not trying to vilify. I want people to understand systemically, because that's where the solutions are to be found. In terms of your second question on the money, I forgot what it was.
Can I do a quick stab at that
Yeah,
one?
go
Because
ahead.
I'd like to
Please do.
get some more questions.
Yeah.
Economic hotspots where these issues are coming together. I would do searches under the phrase just transition. Last fall, we had a program about that featuring UMass economist Bob Poland and some others. And what the phrase means is, how do we make a just transition from an economy based on fossil fuels and a militarized economy to one that is essentially a green economy? And that could require the larger structural transformations that Eric was talking about earlier. But that kind of thinking is going on in a lot of places by different kinds of thinkers and activists. I would just have that phrase in mind and dig in there.
And we'll deal with this in the film as best we can. And it goes back to the earlier question, if I'm remembering this question. You can't separate the nuclear issue, the question of inequality, the question of climate. What was the objective of the Cold War? What was the whole point? Well, there's a domestic objective and a global objective. The global was assert U.S. power and finances and dollar and so on and so on. What's the domestic objective? The same Cold War ideology. Get all the progressives out of the unions. Get people on the left fired. What are they talking about now? Kurt gets assassinated. The next day, Trump says we're going after the entire left architecture. They're going to want to go after 501c3s and universities. And we're right back in McCarthyism. Because the Cold War domestic agenda was weaken workers organizing, weaken workers fight for higher wages, weaken unions, use the Red Scare to purge Hollywood, purge government, squash anybody with any shred of class consciousness. That was the domestic agenda. The global agenda was, expand finance, expand American empire, and so on. You can't separate inequality. You can't separate why people can't afford rent. It's the same. We're dealing with a systemic thing, and the Cold War ideology, it's just listen to Donald Trump. It's word for word what we heard in the 50s.
Hi, my name is Vicki Elson. I'm a double alum of UMass, proud to say. I want to thank you for raising awareness on this incredibly important issue and congratulate you on getting Emma Thompson on board. This is fantastic. I agree with you that we have to wake up to this danger. I couldn't agree more. I agree we need to understand the history and the lies. We need to combine climate and nuclear weapons and inequality and all the other issues. They do all share the same cause, which is called greed and corruption. And I heartily agree with you about that. I agree there's no such thing as good or evil. I agree that if we have nuclear weapons, though, it's game over for everything. And so that is extremely urgent. What concerns me is the focus on risk reduction as compared to total abolition. So the steps that are in the film listed up there, like take the president's finger off the button, great, and especially the current president, but anybody in any country that has a button shouldn't have one person finger on the button without any checks and balances. I mean, that makes sense, but that doesn't get rid of nuclear weapons. Or you can say no first use, tell the US not to start a nuclear war. That's great, but that does not solve the problem. The problem is the existence of even one nuclear weapon, which one nuclear weapon could fill every burn bed on the planet and overwhelm the entire Red Cross, Red Crescent. One bomb is too many. And if we wait for one bomb for people to wake up, I shudder to think. I think it really might be too late. So I've been working on this stuff about as long as you have. And when I started, I thought those steps sounded really good. Until I realized that no, they actually allow the status quo to continue. If we try to make it safer, then it can keep going and going. And if we want to stop it completely, we're going to have to think bigger than risk reduction. We're going to have to look at nuclear abolition. And luckily, we have the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which I hope you will address this, because it seems to be the biggest hope we have. You know, our country is so blind to the anti-nuclear movement globally, but it's huge. You know, we're expecting Kyrgyzstan to sign the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons this week, which means half the world is committed to the total and complete abolition of everything to do with nuclear weapons, including financing them. So a thing that I struggle with a lot is how to balance hope and fear. Because if people just have fear, they're going to crawl into the bed and they're not going to want to do anything. And I think that's a big part of the denial problem too. I mean, I want to crawl into the bed, I get it, you know. But we have to balance that with hope. And if you have only hope, then people think you're just pie in the sky and you're unrealistic. But I think setting the bar at only risk reduction is, it might seem easier. It's probably actually not. None of this is easy. None of it's easy, or we would have done it already. But setting the bar any lower than total abolition is, abolition is what we need to survive. I think we need to demand the very thing we need. If we set the bar lower, then we're going to get negotiated away. If you start your bidding too low, you're going to get ripped off. So that's what I wanted to say. I want to acknowledge the people in the room who are part of the Warheads to Windmills Coalition and other organizations that are working in an interdisciplinary way, working with politicians, working with profiteers, and also getting out the vote, also crucially. All these things are important. And I just really want to thank you for your piece of this. And I hope that your film can help to build a mass movement that we would like to have. We're going to have to solve this problem with or without one, or we won't be here. But I would love it if your film contributed to a mass movement and mass awareness and hope and setting the bar high on the solutions, and not just hoping that we can continue, staggering along as we have been. So thank you again so much.
Thank you.
We're getting down toward the end, so maybe just a brief final,
Well, now I remember what you asked me. I'll jump to the end and then I'll deal with the first part of what you said. We're not just doing a film, we're going to create a website. First of all our interviews with Dan and everyone else, which is over 100 leading experts, activists, and so on, they're all going to be in full on the website. We're going to have links to every organization working on the nuclear issue, whether they're for abolition or whether they're for risk reduction. If we're going to have a section of the website that says, what can I do? You can go there, you can find all the organizations. We're going to have a version of the film on the website, which every time we say something like what I've been saying here, there's going to be a QR code, or a link, but a QR code that will take you to our research. And you'll know why we say what we say. Because we're being very careful, everything we say is going to be verified, but every single thing has a deep rabbit hole to go down, and the website will have the rabbit holes. But most importantly, it will be a hub for all kinds of organizations to share research, share information, and for people to find those organizations if they want to work with them. So we're not creating a new organization, but we do want to create a hub. On the question of abolition, I'm an Ellsbergian on this issue. Dan was muted, and I will be to some extent too. He didn't critique the treaty, But he did point out there's not a single nuclear country that has signed. Not only that, there's not a single NATO country that can sign because NATO's nuclear. And it is a very good aspiration, but I believe, and so did Dan, if you get to a world where you can get to that kind of agreement, you're in a different world, and I would love to get there. But there's a problem here, and this is just one piece of problem. No Russia and no China is going to sign an agreement to abolish nuclear weapons as long as the Americans have conventional superiority. So abolition is far more than abolition. You were talking about a massive cut to the American military budget, a complete withdrawal from Europe militarily. You're talking about closing bases. This isn't just about, oh, let's abolish. Because if you're Russia and you're going to get crushed through conventional war, how do you give up your nukes? And the same thing with China. I mean, China's developing now such a conventional force, they can, maybe, likely win a Taiwan fight without nukes. Okay, maybe. The problem is the United States wants what they call all-spectrum dominance. It's their language, not mine. In space, in cyber, on the seas, on land, you name it, including they want nuclear supremacy. As long as there's that, but especially conventional if you want, how does a Russia say, oh, we don't, the only way we can stop conventional forces, the Russians will say, and they're not wrong, is because we have nukes. And they're even, you can see them threatening it in Ukraine. So I think, and I've said this to leaders of ICANN and other people, let's agree to disagree. Because I think it's great calling for abolishing nuclear weapons. It educates people about the danger, and I would never suggest someone shouldn't do it. But I think we have to advocate a systemic understanding and deal with some of the most urgent. We cannot put off getting rid of ICBMs and launch on warning. Don't build the Iron Dome. Get rid of any capacity for first strike. If we could get even don't build the Iron Dome will be a big, people don't get how destabilizing an anti-ballistic missile system is. It sounds great, oh shit, we'll be defended. Well, first of all, it can't work. I was saying before, my joke about it is it's not about the dome, it's about the gold. It's a big boondoggle, but because of AI, it's Star Wars with AI. We don't actually know that what if it might work some because of AI. Now, it's possible AI can figure, they've been saying an anti-ballistic missile system is like hitting a bullet with a bullet, and they've never been able to do it. Every test fails. But maybe AI could hit a bullet with a bullet, maybe. It starts to tip the balance. Now, the problem is, even if AI can hit a bullet with a bullet, it can't distinguish between a bullet and the bullshit. Because there's no such thing as an ICBM comes in and it's just a missile. What comes in is a missile surrounded by decoys. So the whole thing is nonsense. There's only one way it might work. That is, AI says something's coming, and we may not know what a bullet and the decoys are, but guess what? Why don't we nuke it in space and we'll knock everything out, including all the satellites? In other words, the only way Golden Dome works is nuclear war in space. That's where they're going. So people got to know this. So I'm all for abolishing, but right now, between launch on warning and ICBMs, and even more dangerous in some ways, although it's hard to compare, but this Golden Dome plan is beyond, we're already insane, so I don't even know what the words are for it. Anyway, so I encourage you, fight for abolition. but we're going to do both.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you all for coming out.
Can I?
Yeah, can you want to say something?
All right, so this up here is a way to get on our email list. So you do the QR, it takes you to a website if you want to keep track of what's happening with the film. If you actually want to do something to help us get the film out, get on the list, and in the email, let us know you'd like to help. And at some point, I'm hoping we can actually like have a chapter here on university where people that want to help get the film out will stay in the loop. So if you're interested, that's that. And other than that, thanks so much.
Thanks.